This is Nasha Kasha, Ukrainian Almanac. 28 minutes of stories for everyone about Ukrainian life. I'm your reporter, Stefan Andrusiak, from Winnipeg and Mississauga. This is episode 283. Directed by John Fuskevich, a documentary film called A Canadian War Story tells of Canadians of Ukrainian descent who served during the Second World War. The film was released during Remembrance Week in 2020, but because of COVID, it could not be seen in theaters. The film was produced by the Ukrainian Canadian Research and Documentation Centre in Toronto in participation with the Ukrainian War Veterans Association of Canada. This month, as COVID restrictions loosen, theatre showings are being planned in locations across Canada. Today, the story behind A Canadian War Story, as we meet two key participants in bringing this film to life. We begin in Winnipeg.
John Paskovich. I live in Winnipeg. I've lived in Winnipeg most of my life. I was born in Austria in a displaced persons camp after the war. My parents moved to Montreal. I was about 5 years old when that happened, and I was about 12. We moved to Winnipeg. I've lived here ever since with a few stopovers in Toronto and Montreal. Yes, we're in Kildonan Park. It's a beautiful park. It's in the far edge of the North End. It's in an area called West Kildonan. What's new? I'm still working in my areas of work, documentary, film, and photography. Since we met last, Steve, I've completed a documentary film on the contribution of Ukrainian Canadians in World War II. I just finished that last year, and the year previous, I had a one-person show at the Winnipeg Art Gallery.
A one-person show, a retrospective of your films or of your still photography, because that's a sizable collection.
Yeah, my still photography, it wasn't so much a retrospective, it was 50 photographs of the North End.
Could you tell me about your love of photography and the path that took, where it took you, and where you are right now with your collection?
I started doing photography quite late. I finished university, and then I went to Europe for a year. I traveled around in Western Europe, Eastern Europe, which was still under communism. I went to Israel, and I took along a little amateur camera, and I really enjoyed the feeling that I got when I looked through a viewfinder. It just seduced me, and so when I came back, I enrolled at Ryerson, and I stutter, which I do, but I studied film and photography there.
When I take a picture, I make sure that it's in focus, not hard to do with the modern cameras and cell phones, and make sure that the lighting is okay, it's not obliterating people's faces, and that everybody is within frame. But what does someone who really knows what they're doing at your level look for when they're shooting a picture?
What I like is a photograph that raises a question. There has to be a bit of mystery and enigma there, or humor, or like, well, what's going on?
Something that you would reveal that maybe, I mean, how do you do that quickly?
Luck helps. Luck helps. Most of the photographs that a photographer takes aren't any good. So you have to shoot a lot and hope, serendipity happens.
The magic moment.
The magic moment, or as the master photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson said, the decisive moment, yeah.
Tell me about Ukrainians in Canada and pre-World War II and then World War II. Before the film itself, what was it that you looking through the viewfinder, saw that others may not have seen as apparent and you wanted to convey?
The Canadian government invited Ukrainians to populate the Canadian prairies. When the first Ukrainians came to Canada, thousands arrived. There was a lot of resistance against them about settling here. All the resistance came from the already settled Old Stock British and Old Stock French, and the Ukrainians were referred to in the media and in politics as non-preferred. During this time, a Ukrainian settler who was also a poet, his name was Michael Goda. Michael Goda wrote a poem. In its essence, it said that Ukrainians in Canada would never be recognized as true and real Canadians until they shed blood. When World War I started, many Ukrainians were offered to serve in the Canadian Armed Forces, but because most of them came from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire was at war with Canada, their wish to serve in the Canadian forces was rejected because they were suspected of being a fifth column for the Austrians. Interestingly, the Ukrainians that came from the Russian Empire were allowed to enlist in the Canadian Armed Forces, and a Ukrainian from the Russian Empire, Philip Conwell, won the Victorian Cross for his service in the Canadian Armed Forces.
Tsarist Russia was an ally.
Tsarist Russia was an ally of Britain and France. Yes. After the Second World War ended, this notion that Ukrainian Canadians were still non-preferred was very, very strong. It became stronger when the Depression hit, because there was a competition for scarce jobs. And when a job application happened, a Ukrainian inevitably did not get the job. In order to help get the job, a lot of Ukrainians changed their names and lied about their ethnicity. For example, a guy whose name might have been Moroz, which means frost, he simply changed his name to the Anglo version, Frost. He became Frost.
How did this period, what happened to sway the opinion of Canadians as to how they looked at Ukrainians and maybe other minorities from that part of Eastern Europe?
Okay, when World War II started, Ukrainians enlisted in great numbers. After the war, it was found out that approximately 40,000 Ukrainians enlisted in the armed forces. That was the highest number of any ethnic group outside of the British, and that includes the French-Canadian enlistment rate. So after that, the reputation that Ukrainian Canadians in the armed forces gained, a reputation of valor and courage, the rest of Canadian society opened up. Jobs which previously were off limits, for example, in the police force or in the fire department or at Eaton's or the Bay, suddenly there were people working there with Ukrainian names.
So they shed blood, earned their place with their valor.
Yeah, so Michael Goda's poem proved prophetic. The film wasn't made so much to make money. In fact, most documentary films don't make money. The film was made to record as much as we could the contribution of Ukrainian Canadians in World War II. It's a doggone shame that it took so long to make this film about the Ukrainian Canadian contribution, because the stories are very amazing. This film should have been done 20 or 25 years ago when the veterans were still well, and we could actually film them talking live into the camera.
Well, we will remember them, as we will all who have fallen and all who have served and serve today this Remembrance Day. Thank you very much.
Туман яром, туман долиною, туман яром, туман долиною. Обізвався козачень козаю, обізвався козачень козаю, а я теє вітерце дістану і з тобою на рушничих стану.
From Ukraine, this is the group Sonce Svit. Tuman Yarom is about a fog in a ravine, beyond which lies uncertainty.
Туман яром, туман долиною, туман яром, туман долиною.
My name is Andriy Sochanewski. I am a resident of Mississauga and have been involved with various kinds of military veterans programs and initiatives over the last 10 years.
Can you give me a sense of your family's roots?
My family comes from Eastern Europe, specifically Ukraine. And as the war was ending and the Germans were retreating westward, being pursued by the Soviet army, my parents' family and both my mother and father's family fled as refugees, in essence, and wound up in Germany at the end of the Second War in a displaced persons camp. From there, my father's family came to Canada. They initially came to Alberta, to Lethbridge. They worked there for a short period to repay, in essence, their transportation costs to come to Canada as displaced persons, and eventually wound up in Toronto. My mother's family went from Germany to Belgium, where my grandfather worked in the coal mines in Belgium, and from there they went to the United States. My mother eventually, as she got older in her 20s, she pursued a university education at the University of Toronto, where she met my father, and eventually they both settled and got married and had a family, and that's where I came from.
Brothers, sisters?
I have one brother and two sisters.
And where did the idea of service in the military for your country come from?
I grew up like anybody else. Toronto. I was born in Etobicoke. Went to a public school in Etobicoke. Eventually moved to Mississauga, and my siblings were born. I was from a very young age active in the Ukrainian Canadian community. I went to Ukrainian school. On Saturdays, I was a member of PLOS, which is a youth organization in Toronto. I attended summer camps, school, and other kinds of events, and was quite involved with the Ukrainian Canadian community. And at that time, big focus for the Ukrainian Canadian community was independence and freedom from Ukraine, from the Soviet Union. So I was involved with that right from a very, very young age, as were my siblings. I always did have a bit of an interest for the military. I was particularly fascinated by aviation. I recall as a young child, my father used to take me to the Canadian National Air Show at the exhibition in Toronto, and I vividly remember seeing jets and other planes perform, and I thought, wow, that would be something really interesting. At the same time, I was raised during the Cold War, and I wanted to make sure that Canada was protected from the Warsaw Pact at the time, and that Europe and NATO was doing its bit, and I wanted to be part of that. So I kind of combined the love, the passion for aviation with service and defense of Canada, and joined the armed forces back in I guess would have been in 1984, 1985. I was accepted into the Royal Roads Military College, and which was based in Victoria in British Columbia, and I attended there for 2 years, pursuing an engineering degree, and from there I moved to the Royal Military College in Kingston, where at the time the engineering programs in the final 2 years were being offered. Finished up there with a degree in electrical engineering, and from there went off to pursue my dream of aviation as an air combat systems officer. My first job was on a patrol squadron based in Nova Scotia, right on the East Coast. I was part of a maritime patrol crew in the Air Force. So we had anywhere from 10 to 12 members. And that crew consisted of pilots, air combat systems officers, and other kind of specialties. So we had a blend of officers and non-commissioned members. All of the people in the crew were highly educated. So they've taken either college courses or certainly would have university degrees in large case with the officers, or they would have taken highly specialized training. So I worked with highly, very intelligent, talented, trained people. And of course, the aircraft was maintained by, technicians who were also highly trained. The primary mission of the squadron at the time was the detection and tracking of initially Soviet nuclear submarines, and of course that became Russian nuclear submarines when the Soviet Union collapsed. And I spent many years there flying the North Atlantic and spending a lot of time in Europe. Had a very exciting career.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you.
When was the decision, or how was the decision made that it was time to do something else?
My initial service started in 1984, and I served until 1997. I was very happy in the armed forces. I was happy and proud of the work that I had accomplished. And I think for me, it was largely I needed a change. As much as I loved Nova Scotia, I was originally from Toronto and really dreamed about returning to a big city, which I was able to do, by the way, in my last year of service. I actually was a recruiting officer here in Toronto for about a year and a half.
Were you already a father and married in the armed forces?
No, I was not. I was single, and certainly the thoughts of getting married were upon my mind at some point. But I wanted to make sure that I had kind of my new career pegged. I guess my London connection, completed a degree, Master of Business Administration, MBA from the Ivy Business School based in London. Lived there actually for 2 years. Most importantly, I met my spouse in London. She was doing her residency at the University of Western Ontario for family medicine, and I met her there in London as well. And in fact, we got married shortly afterwards.
So you went into business?
When I graduated, I worked as a consultant for many years, for about 10 years, focusing on information technology. Was caught up in the whole Y2K.com, excitement as well. So I was very, very happy. Did a lot of very interesting work across North America, primarily in the United States, and then I, as you get older, this is, I traveled pre 9/11, post 9/11. Travel really began to change post 9/11. It became more difficult, and certainly appreciate why, in terms of additional security requirements. But it became very, very more and more painful. More lines, more things to follow, more rules. And I knew at some point that I would probably need to stop the travel. It was getting very, very tiring, and of course wanted to raise a family as well.
So you hearken back to your years of service and the history of Ukrainians in the armed forces, and you came up with an idea, or you and some friends did.
So I when I returned back to Mississauga, in essence, my home, I was aware of what was going on, certainly in the Ukrainian Canadian community, but wasn't really deeply involved, largely because I just didn't have the time. Gradually, as I settled down to a role where there wasn't as much travel, I had more time to begin to look at different things, and was approached by different people in various projects, and got involved with the Ukrainian War Veterans Association, an organization that's been in existence since 1928, and about I guess 7-8 years ago, I actually became the president of the organization. I remain as president today. Back, I believe, it was in 2013, so a number of years ago, I was approached by a few people from the Ukrainian Canadian Research and Documentation Center, which is based in Toronto. They had done a number of interviews with the Ukrainian Canadian World War II veterans back in the late 80s, early 90s. And they had an idea, or a desire at least, to create a documentary based on those interviews. There was an attempt made to do a documentary on those using those interviews, I think in the early 1990s, but for whatever reason, the project did not proceed. And so literally 20 plus years later, 2 decades later, they wanted to kind of restart the project. So some of the directors who used to approach me, and a few others, I immediately agreed to get involved because it was something I was very, very interested in. I knew that there was significant kind of contribution made by Ukrainian Canadians. I didn't have all the details. I know there was a significant contribution. In fact, my wife's grandfather had served in World War II, so I knew I never knew him personally, but I know that was a big part of his life. And I knew that there were many, many others, particularly in Western Canada. My wife's name is Anne-Marie Humniski. Her grandfather was Miron Skramatka, based in Winnipeg, and he served in the army, in the artillery on the west coast of Canada, defending from the Japanese. And then from there, he actually served overseas in Western Europe, and I believe he served in the liberation of the Netherlands.
So a touchstone, very personal to you. Can you take the story from there?
Certainly within Veterans Affairs, there are lots of awareness, or growing awareness, for example, of contributions of Black Canadians, for example, of Jewish Canadians, of Chinese Canadians. And I thought, wow, like we should try to get something similar in terms of awareness for Ukrainian Canadians, because the contributions were immense, particularly given some of the challenges that Ukrainian Canadians faced when they first came to Canada. Discrimination, for example, the internment of Ukrainian Canadians and other Eastern Europeans, for example, So these service members out of certain World War, they were descendants of those people. And, it's something I want to understand is how, their desire and their passion to serve, but in light of some of the challenges that they had faced. So I was on board right from the start, and then over time, played a fairly significant role in getting the film.
Which year again was this?
The film, the initial meeting was in 2013. It isn't like you decide, let's do the movie, and you start the next day. There's a whole process of finding potential directors, documentary filmmakers. There's obviously a budget is required. Funding needs to be secured. We have to have some concept for the film in terms of what it would cover, what kind of content. And then, of course, a very, very critical part is the amount of research required. It took a good 2+ years to gather this, to contact people, contact descendants, go to libraries, go to archives, find the content. And this is content that is not for a book, for example. This is content where there has to be a bit of a story, there have to be photographs, there has to be sound. The film was completed in kind of late 2019, early 20. Unfortunately, we ran into the pandemic. We did do a virtual launch, a digital launch, back in November of, it would have been November of 2020. It's hard to believe how time has flown by. November of 2020 across the country. It was a very successful launch, and now we are in the process of screening the film at theaters. Again, every province, every jurisdiction, is trying to cope with pandemic, and so we're just kind of trying to figure out how to best do this.
You signed up at a time of peace.
Yes.
And these men signed up when war was either imminent or was underway. Can you talk about how you relate to what they must have felt?
Sure, and this is again one of those key things that they signed up at time of war. largely voluntary. In terms of the research that we did in the document, there was a kind of conscription crisis in Canada, if you recall, in the mid 1940s. But most of the Ukrainian Canadians who served voluntarily. They signed up, right at the start of the war, so. I mean, it's quite, and certainly in the early days of the war, from a Canadian perspective, other than probably Hong Kong, the fighting really didn't get going till D-Day. So I think probably many service people wanted to certainly do their bit for Canada. And from a Ukrainian Canadian perspective, they wanted to show that they were as good as and loyal to Canada as anybody else. And so 11%, that is the highest in terms of ethnic background as a percentage of the kind of population base of that ethnic group. That is the largest. So 11%, 1 in 10. You can imagine larger families at the time, at least in Western Canada. If you had a family of 10, at least one person was in uniform in service of Canada.
Women among them?
Women among them as well. Absolutely, yes.
This is the first Remembrance Day following the closing of a long chapter in Afghanistan.
Yes.
Any special kind of reflections on that or any other aspect of remembering the fallen and those who are serving?
This year, 2021, it's the 20th anniversary of 9/11, which was the trigger for, as you know, the war on terror, which included the campaign or the war in Afghanistan, for example. So I certainly look back upon I think 156 or so Canadians that were killed during the war, trying to help the country, to rid the world of some very, very bad people. In this particular remembrance, I'm also thinking Hong Kong fell in 1941. A number of Canadians obviously were imprisoned. Were imprisoned after a valiant fight in Hong Kong, and that included a number of Ukrainian Canadians, because many of those units, one of the key units in that were the Winnipeg Grenadiers, which had a very large contingent of Ukrainian Canadians. So I kind of specifically Ukrainian Canadians, but in general for all Canadian soldiers. So those are some of two big anniversaries that come to mind, and I think about the soldiers that passed away. I think about their families. Every year it's kind of a solemn moment to reflect, to acknowledge, and to share our appreciation for their service in defense of Canada and in defense of the free world.
This is Highway of Heroes, written and performed by the Canadian group The Trues.
Carry me home down the highway of heroes, people I love with their heads down low, and carry me softly down the highway of heroes, true patriot love. There was never more, there was never more, there was never more, there was never more, there was never